with the ubiquity of technology and the pace at which it's moving now, it's not enough. So we're going to talk about things like compliance, security, governance, and equal rights to organizations. And I've got people way smarter than me. We're going to talk about it here today. We've got Adam, Kuldeep, and Gary. I'll turn it to them to do a left to right introduction of themselves.
Who's left?
You're left, Gary.
Hey, I'm Gary Palmatier, CEO of Red Argyle. Been in tech since the late 90s, which has a sting to it. Been with Salesforce since 2008. Over with Tom and with Salesforce for mostly enterprise tech companies.
All right, so I'll introduce myself. I am Steve. I'm with Tech2. I am a data and AI governance strategist. I've been in the data industry for about 24 years, mostly in financial services. About 15 years, I've done some retail, some philanthropy, but all of it has been in data analytics, AI, and governance. For Haiku, so I work for Haiku. Like I said, I'm based out of Denver. For Haiku, I am a strategist where I look at what are some of the capabilities that we take to market in this space, and how do we keep up to the clients, and how do we modernize some of the capabilities that our clients are looking for, right? And then more and more of where I am seeing the data mode kind of shifting towards is how do we make our data AI ready, how do we make it usage ready. So that's what excites me. I've been doing it for 20 years. Great time to be in the industry right now if you're a data specialist. And I'm super excited about where the industry is heading and where data is heading and where analytics is heading over the next 2 years.
Hi, my name is Edward Franklin. Relatively speaking, I'm the baby of this group. I've been involved in tech for about 15 years. Prior to that, I was completely unrelated industry. I'm also with Haiku, where I function as a technical architect, primarily focused on Salesforce and cloud-based solutions, but occasionally working with firms on things that have nothing to do with the business things. And in all cases, try to think about a lot of what we're going to talk about today.
All right, thanks everyone. I'm going to lob some questions at y'all, and then maybe when we got 15 or 20 minutes left, we'll start letting you lob questions at them. So from a hearing, keep in mind, and we'll get some audience participation here as well. Kuldeep, I'm going to throw the first one at you. Beyond my terrible clinical explanation of the shared responsibility model is, can you kind of ground us in your definition and your experience with it and how you've seen it present in the spaces that you specialize in?
Yeah, let me try one opinion. Improvement is the way to go.
Sure.
Just kidding. Shared responsibility model is not shared service model. Right? I mean, when I first started looking at this topic years back, because we were in industry, we were using shared services, right? So, and like I said, I'm financial services, so about 10 years or so back, I used to work for a large wealth and investment management firm where I was globally heading the data quality and business intelligence function for the asset management division. And that's when we started speaking with Google and Azure and Microsoft, right? In financial services, it was still new to start heading it and starting to think about cloud services. And very quickly, being a data professional, very quickly I realized that it's great to adopt cloud and what the cloud's providers are really providing as capabilities. However, very quickly I realized that I have a bulk of responsibility over my data, right? And that's why I started critically thinking about what shared responsibility model is, which is when you're interacting with the cloud, what can you expect from the cloud service provider, like an Azure or Google or AWS or whichever flavor you're looking at, and really being extremely clear about what your responsibility is, right? What hasn't changed are the principles. I mean, if you're thinking about financial services or healthcare or any of the regulated industries, we have all dealt with our data centers. I started my career as a database administrator, 24 years back. I used to live in the data center, so I'm very familiar with, what responsibilities do we have, right? Whether it's the infrastructure, whether it has the physical security, what's in the data center, how do you protect your data center, including all of the servers and all of the machinery, the network, and everything that we have on here. But as the models started moving more towards the cloud, and that whole paradigm still existed. It's just that who is responsible for what was really what we were auditing when we started working with these vendors or these service providers. So essentially, the way to look at it is, for me, is that there's a platform. No matter where you are, right, whether it's infrastructure as a service or platform as a service or any of other variations. There's a platform, there's an application, there's your data, your access management. So for me, it was, given that I'm a data person, it became fairly clear that the responsibility of the data still lies with me. Even though the cloud provider has infrastructure, has tools, has the technology to support me, it's just that I needed to kind of audit and see what I'm responsible for, what they're responsible for, and really being extremely clear about that, because that is the way we were able to essentially protect a global tech. Right? So hopefully I was able to provide that answer as to, really thinking about how to share those responsibilities.
Thank you. Gary, operating a Salesforce consultancy, where do you see this shared responsibility model surface in implementations of Salesforce? And you've also got a slant on security. It's a sweet spot for you if you want to lean into that a little bit too.
Sure.
Great.
Yeah, the way I look at it, Salesforce marketing is awesome. As you know, they have a marketing machine. Their number one value as a company is trust. And to what Kuldeep was saying, it's very easy to say Salesforce's number one value is trust. So I'm just going to put all my data out there, and it's going to be fine forever. And that's true to a point. And when we start to think about shared responsibility in a Salesforce implementation, I use this story, if you will. Pretend you have a car, a Volvo. I like Volvo. Safety is their thing, right? If you think about it in a shared responsibility mindset, Volvo is responsible for providing you with a car with adequate safety measures and brakes that work. And your side of the handshake is, I'm not going to drive my car into a ditch. And in the lifecycle of Salesforce, especially for a couple of reasons. Number one, again, trust and number one value. Everyone thinks they're bulletproof, which at the platform level, I wholeheartedly believe they are, just for the record. I've never heard of a Salesforce data issue where someone broke into a Salesforce data center and exfiltrated data. That kind of stuff has never happened. The second reason is that Salesforce is so admin and configurator friendly that it's very easy to essentially drive your car into a ditch with a Salesforce implementation. Things like experience cloud sites or public endpoints and not having the sharing model configured properly. The third thing is, GASP, Salesforce is 20-year-old technology now, and there's some old school implementations still kicking in production. So if you think about something that's 20 years old, in Volvo sense, the brakes might be a little rusty, maybe it needs some maintenance, and no one's really, kind of looked under the hood in a while, and you've been through 20 admins and all that stuff that happens over decades of a system being in existence, old data kicking around. So, from my mindset, I often spend a lot of time just talking to my customers about the basics. Have you audited your system? Do you have a data retention policy? Do you have a data destruction policy? Is Salesforce still performing the same business functions that it did originally when we got it? And then what's the ego side? So there's a lot to talk about there, but that's my quick answer. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Adam, are you ready? So, as an architect and with a lean toward integrations, multiple apps, multiple systems, so you're kind of at the heart of the customer you're working with, the platforms you're pushing and pulling from. What does shared responsibility model look? How does it look good from your perspective when you're trying to integrate and orchestrate these systems all together? And what kind of benefits do you see come out of it, both from a technology and an organization?
Yes, I think there's a lot of benefits that do come from this, right? Sometimes we're hesitant, the time and energy in this thing that feels like more of a habit we would not want to do. But when I think about it, there's the obvious benefit of, let's avoid risk. Let's actually be compliant with whatever regulations we have to comply with. But there's also, there's a certain amount of expediency and speed gains. There's an efficiency that we get. So when we start to establish these clear policies, right, there's no question now about what's going to happen. If you have governance, and that governance has milestones, then you just kind of know the path you're going on for all the other changes that are coming. There's a degree of predictability there. I think that reduces organizational anxiety. It also makes it easier to understand how your systems are being built and implemented, which anyone who's worked with a large organization knows. Sometimes just reasoning about how implementation is difficult. You may not have all the information. So anything you can do to get closer to that is going to help a lot. Lastly, I would say one of the benefits, and maybe this is stretching, but I think that part of shared responsibility is actually education, right? So especially now where we have so much software as a service and we have people getting out there and just democratizing things, the more education you have for the people within the institution, the more opportunities you have for continuous improvement. Folks that are aware of these things and thinking about them, they may have some insights or some perspectives on things that the quote experts aren't going to necessarily have because they're just not close enough to day to day. So I would say that, aside from the obvious things, there's definitely quite a bit of benefit there.
Thanks, Adam. Cool. Let's hit some questions around, organizational maturity as it relates to the model. Kuldeep, I'm curious what you've seen in terms of maturity, scale of the responsibility model for organizations. Is it size? Is it age? Is it the things they're trying to do? What sort of drives you to go from version 1 to version 5 of the model and the compliance and security that comes along with it?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I think we are living in an age right now where the pace of change is faster than it has been. And I was telling the story of 2013 with this large global investment bank. We would have like about 50 or 60 POCs running at any unit, with data science, with machine learning back then, and artificial intelligence. Like we were doing all sorts of testing around sentiment analysis, product analysis. However, there was no path, and all of this was done because the bank was all about innovation. However, when the next question our managing directors, right, our leaders would ask, so how do we take this to the market? We really didn't have an answer for that, right? So we were like a shop of 100 POCs and had a really good framework or a roadmap to drive these POCs. And really, the realization was that, how do we scale, right, from a POC to actually use in production? The second thing was also the data that we were sitting on top of. Right? If you think about organizations today, there are about 4 to 5, maybe some organizations have suggested of using 10% of their data. I think we were talking about it at lunch. And what happens to the rest of 90%? And as generative AI, as agentic AI, as AI has become more and more prevalent, and it's not a buzzword anymore, right? It was, maybe we were confused about, is it a buzzword 5 years back, or is it not? It's not anymore. And so as we are being stretched, right, the stretch can come from all of the V's of data, right? The variability, the veracity, the volume. We are only tapping into our structured data. Our repositories in the cloud, are all about our structured data. How do we bring the unstructured and semi-structured and how organizations will get productive or used to that? That's one aspect of it. But over lunch, I was speaking with Navit about it. Also the application of it, right? What is the business asking for? What are the capabilities that they're asking for? And that kind of changes the paradigm a little bit. Although you're sitting on top of all of this data, what is the business asking for? What are the capabilities that are necessary? So as we continue to delve into these capabilities, it's really stretching the shared responsibility model. One is, how do you deal with the data itself? Like all of these different types of data. Now, organizations are also, like I said, many organizations do a lot of proof of concepts, right? And as a result of that, marketing is doing something, your compliance teams might be doing something else. All of a sudden, because of this veracity and volume of data, you end up with data silos. Data silos, as we know, are expensive. And so how does that kind of impact the policy that you might already have in place in terms of the usage of data? Now with cloud, right, it's really easy to kind of go out and build a data lake or some kind of a data service where people can actually experiment with all of the data that and the volume of data that you use. However, your policies haven't quite kept up with it, right? Whether you think about data governance, whether you think about stewardship, people don't know necessarily, organizations don't know how to deal with their structured and unstructured data. Right now, that kind of feeds into all of what you're doing on the regulation side, whether it is GDPR, CCPA. In Europe, MiFID too, right, where you have to kind of really be very transparent with what you're doing with your data. Now, how do your policies kind of that you might have in place go back and really align with the principles and the regulations that you have to deal with, but also how do you do that as well, right? So there's I think the implications are vast now. Where I'm seeing the maturity, to answer your question, right? I think organizations, other than hyperscalers, right, they're still figuring out how to deal with it. A lot of organizations are starting to think about if these were the principles that we are aligning to, what are the frameworks that we need to kind of start rethinking or thinking about, right? If you are already a user of the cloud, you already have some of the frameworks and policies and principles in place. But now, how to stretch them, right? What are some of the new things that we have to think about? What are the new risks that are coming into being that are kind of really stretching your policies and the principles that you already have? And then really, how do you kind of adhere to the regulations, right? Especially high-regulated industries. So I think organizations are, some of them are further out, like I said, hyperscalers tech industries. But financial services, healthcare, I've been working with some legal industry, legal companies, some law firms, the legal industry. I think they are early on in kind of starting to think about how do you really leverage the shared responsibility element and not only use what the hyperscalers are providing, but also how do you kind of continue to build upon your capabilities.
So we talk about maturity. Let's talk a little bit about scale. If there's anything more to do with scale, when we talk about global organizations that are not just operating in the U.S. but operating, in many different countries, many different compliance, etc. Gary, can you talk a little bit about your experiences with how maybe you just have one model, but maybe there's models as they relate to the countries or the geographies that they hail from.
Europe is fun. There you go. When Ms. Fulton, from a maturity perspective, I think, particularly for an organization doing business globally, you don't need to be a GDPR expert to think about some basics from a maturity perspective that can help with your international compliance goals. So I'm a huge fan of the Center for Information Security. I don't know if you're familiar with their body of work. But they have a series, they call it the critical security controls. I think it's 23 domains that you can measure your organizational maturity on. And essentially what they do is they ask like 30, 50 questions per category, like physical infrastructure, cloud infrastructure, backups, reporting, data management, etc. They have all these domains, and you go through the ones that are relevant. This is how you go from a 0 to a 100. First, you have no awareness of the requirement whatsoever. Like, say, let's pick on backup. I didn't even know I needed to back up my data. It would be a 0. Then we go to, I have an informal process, like, Joey in the back room sometimes gives me a tape. Then you have a formal process. Every Friday we're performing a backup. The next thing is it reportable? Can you run some kind of item to say where the backup's stuck? And finally, is it automated? Can you perform that element with no human intervention? And finally, is it bugged? So it kind of gives you this maturity scale that you can break down these really complicated compliance things into saying, did I even know it existed? Do I have an informal, formal, reportable, automated, and governed policy to get there? So what I've noticed with a whole lot of, I'll pick on GDPR, is applicable to a lot of us. It's really, really scary, but even if you only get to the second or third level of maturity, it's often enough to be considered compliant. An example is a data takeout. Thinking of someone coming to your organization saying, I need a full dump of all the data regarding my persona, and you have to delete it. So I've been involved in engineering conversations where the complexity spirals out of control. So we said, well, let's just build a policy for that and make sure there's a procedure where should a request come in, someone can manually review it and we follow up with all that stuff. So we're only going a little bit out the maturity scale, but we're still checking the boxes and having adequate answers to those compliance items. I'm not saying that is always the answer, but going back to basics, I think a lot of organizations, it's so easy to get wrapped around the axle of addressing all the complexity at once, when really it's something to just chip away at over time. So other ones that, Europe, for example, they got the forthcoming Digital Online Resilience Act that has a lot to do with shared responsibility and managing cloud technology. And then DMA just came out, which is regulating competitiveness of your services. The bigger you get, the more likely you could be subject to that, which we're starting to get into a little bit of work with some scaled applications there. So I think the biggest piece is awareness. You can be in an industry or in a geography, and just keeping up on what the regs are is step one, and then figuring out the details from there. Obviously, specialists involved in everyone, but even just in general practice can really help.
Thank you. It wouldn't be a session today if we didn't talk about AI. Good. Sure. I'm interested in everybody's perspective on this. How is AI technology going to challenge and shift these responsibility models within organizations as they need to adopt them? And learn about how fast it's going to scale. So how do you also keep up with what looks like ever-changing technology? So we go, Adam, you want to go first? Go that way.
So I guess the first question is, how much does the paradigm actually have to change? The question of shared responsibility is this idea that the vendor and the purchaser or consumer both have responsibility, and depending on the kind of thing that you bought, your responsibility may be more or less the vendor's responsibility, maybe more or less. Does that really change? I don't know that it fully does. I think the paradigm still stays the same. I think what we discover is there are new things that we have to think about that before just weren't a concern. Before they were, but we could answer those questions more concretely. Now we have this kind of non-deterministic technology that it's generating answers, it's generating information, we're consuming that information. And so this raises these questions of, well, is there an ethical responsibility, not just a technical responsibility? Of course, there's all the other responsibilities, though, that we've already had to worry about. Gary was just talking about compliance. And so you can almost imagine a similar model around AI. Well, are you even aware of what that AI tool that your employees are using is doing? Do you have policy around AI? Do you have controls in place as to what tool get used? So I think it fits very well into the model itself. And I imagine that as we go forward, we're going to discover new things we have to solve for. I also think right now we're kind of in the middle of a lot of technological change. We're not at the end. There's a lot of prognostication going on around what will happen now and in the future. We don't really know yet. So I think we're still kind of in a place where we have to be sensitive to it without necessarily saying we have to change it now.
AI is really stretching the bounds, but as I've already just said it. One example is I was working for a large retail bank, and there was this conversation about 3 or 4 years back about our loan process. How do you kind of go? I think the bank had about 18 loan products, and our mortgage loan process was about a month worth of work, right? And the thought was that now that we have AI, How do we automate some? How do we predict differently? And a lot of our data goes in the cloud. The question back then was that as we started to use artificial languages in cloud, and we actually automate some of the processes, right? Like say, for example, if there are bankers in the room, underwriting takes a long time, right? Which is where you have interacted with your client, they've given you your prospect, and they've given you all of the documents, and now you're going through all of this, probably the mortgage process. And that whole determining what's your risk level, you are right with your other clients. That whole process is pretty complex. The thought was, hey, how do we use artificial intelligence? How do we use the data that we have and really speed that whole process up? Now, the worry that was there was that, okay, the AI can predict. However, what about Fair Lending Act, right, which is the regulation? How about GDPR, CCPA? There are about, I think you mentioned, there are about 31 states in the United States who have varying level degrees of regulations for artificial intelligence usage of data in the cloud. How do you with all of that, right? So it's great because now there are opportunities, there are possibilities of using AI for processes that were not being automated. However, there is always this fear of what's going to be the result and how we will be able to explain, right? So that's one aspect of it, and I think Gary mentioned that all of the regulations that we have to deal with, right? GDPR, CCPA, European Act. How do we really interpret that in relevance to what we've been doing as a business that we've been existing? I mean, many of the businesses that exist for hundreds of years, right? Some of these processes are documented, some of them are not documented. And so how do you kind of create regulation and then align to that, right, as you start to use your artificial intelligence? One thing that I am seeing my customers ask me about is governance. Like how do you kind of as you start towards artificial intelligence, there's a lot of interest in governance. And the way I talk to them about it is that your principles of governance are what, right? Whether it is bringing people in, so human in the loop, as it is called, and how do you kind of build those stewardship, networks in your organization? Those principles haven't changed. Anything to do with more of the defensive side of your governance, which is whether you're kind of the security, regulation, those things have not changed. Right? Now you start moving towards the right even more so, where you're talking about your data quality. What about the lineage of your data, right? Because as you're going to move into artificial intelligence, understanding where your data started, where all it has changed, where it's going, all of that is important, right? So, I think starting to think, a lot of the clients that we work with are starting to think more and more about governance, artificial intelligence governance, and how does that apply to what they were wanting to do. Right? And now bringing it back to shared responsibility model, I think what the cloud service providers are doing is that they're making it easier, right? Like whether it is how do you kind of test bias, right? How do you kind of explain the decisions that are coming out of your analytics and your artificial intelligence? So these providers, cloud service providers, are already coming up with tools and the filters and content filtering and classifiers, right? They're using machine learning and AI to provide you with answers that you need, then whether you're compliant or not. However, the responsibility, right, of whether you're compliant or not, whether your data is governed, it's secure, it's trustworthy, like it's transparent on all of the processes that you have before you can really sign off or certify your AI usage and really represent that into your market. Those are some of the things, those responsibilities stay with you. So a lot of focus on governance, a lot of focus on just making sure that you're compliant.
Putting on my cybersecurity hat, AI can definitely seem like a pretty spooky and scary black box of mystery. Stuff goes in there and stuff comes back out and you don't know what's going on the inside. And I think that, was anyone here at the keynote with the neural net diagram where it's just like all these lines and then these like check people, get out of here, you don't need to worry about that. And it's true. I mean, as particularly in the business, even in IT teams, like we don't need to know how neural networks process the information. But I approach AI with a healthy degree of skepticism from a cybersecurity perspective because I look at it as a potential vulnerability. It greatly enlarges your attack surface or perimeter, if you want to throw fancy terms around. And how do we start to reduce that? So I think any AI solution, particularly enterprise at scale, needs to have some diligence process applied to it. Number one, I don't like shrink wrap in terms of service because everyone has been trained over the decades to blow through them and click I accept so I can go do the thing I want. And actually getting someone with the wherewithal to read those terms of service I think is really important because you get the details which may set some red flags on is this system using technology that doesn't agree with our compliance posture. Everything from data residency to does it train to are artifacts of your conversations removed from the system or tokenized and all that good stuff. So those are all areas where each AI tool running on some kind of an engine, understanding how they set it up, and things are moving so quickly. I would just say, there's probably varying levels of quality and commitment to that across the industry. Not saying they're all bad, just saying that I'm skeptical until I prove it otherwise. That's how I advise my clients. The second thing around that, just think about something like a simple AI tool where you allow it to OAuth with another system, like automate my meeting scheduling, but when I click that allow the OAuth magic, not that technical in that regard to happen, it suddenly reads the entire contents of my email inbox, which could violate 50 NDAs in the stroke of one mouse click, who knows? So that kind of stuff just makes me think having the right thought process around allowing that, having that moment of pause, going through diligence is important. But what I want to say, I think the bright light at the end of the tunnel is many vendors are rapidly understanding, like, I've got to get this under control to be a profitable company, getting more transparent with their TOS, getting more details on their data practices. And then I think it's a very thoughtful move on Salesforce's part, because we can only act on what we hear or read from a vendor. I would still, even if I've got some assurances, say, how can I still minimize what I'm putting into that black box, still leveraging things like Salesforce's trust layer. Matt talked earlier about don't throw any data in the system that you don't have to. Be very efficient with how you're running that thing, how to anonymize, tokenize all the practices around it to give you that belts and suspenders approach to working with AI. So, I don't want to be a wet blanket when it comes to AI. I will still say we're in amazing times. We're able to innovate quickly, and I think explore and figure this out. There's absolutely paths with different technologies and methods that can get where we want to go with the business and still be secure and compliant. It just requires some thought.
Thanks, everyone. We got 17-ish minutes, I think, left.
I guess, right?
Cool. Open up for questions from the group. Just raise your hand, I'll walk it around and try that. Up here.
Thanks. Mike Cooper with Elliott Energy. So I think you just mostly touched on this point. So like when I think of shared responsibility, I think due diligence from multi-cloud architecture's perspective as well as the usage in the cloud, right? But then you get into some potential conflicts of area or potential conflicts of interest or a gray area where what if the service provider is interested in your data for training their model, right? Or for hopefully not selling it, but like there was a service we were assessing the other day where after several layers of asking the right questions, we finally got down to the fact that if we use their platform, they will use our data to train. And part of that data includes like supply chain information. So it's like we just paid somebody to expose our entire supply chain to potentially our competitors. So and because AI is so new, and it's this tool that's being integrated with every piece of software that's out there. Like Gemini just showed up randomly, like in your Google Suite, right? Like Copilot pops up in Microsoft, and you're like, oh, cool, I can use this. Because these are so new, they don't necessarily have like those in-depth terms of service, right? They don't necessarily have everything spelled out on what they're doing with data, and their policies, privacy policy, all that. So how does one navigate this environment where these questions may not be clear and it's hard to get the answers? Like, is there like a resource we can go to? Is the answer just shut everything off until you do due diligence? Like, how do you proceed in an environment like this?
All right, I'll take first swing. Yeah, it's always tricky, and it's always weighing the cost and benefit of pursuing some technology. I can speak to the Google example particularly because it just showed up, and I think that's happening with a lot of applications where suddenly things are just showing up. Google, I'm aware of how that, we use Google as well, and then one day I'm like, oh, Gemini's in our org, yay. Actually, it is a nice tool, by the way. So we approach it with looking at, we already use Google Workspace for everything. So Google already has all our data. They check all of our compliance boxes thus far. So we went through and just evaluated a risk. Again, I'm just talking within our own practice, and it came out that was okay to continue using it. What we advise against, though, and we don't allow it within our team, is just like, and again, go back to maturity. We have pretty strict controls on what you can control, what you can enable. We have Okta for everything, so unless things are specifically enabled, our team can't go and enable new AI integrations and things like that. So we have compensating controls on that front, and then again, some of our more incumbent providers, we're able to make decisions on whether to enable those tools. I think the second piece is training and awareness when those tools are coming online. I don't know, I think our team is probably a lot more paranoid than a typical team because we work really hard to eat our own dog food with cybersecurity, and there's a lot of skepticism in our org, and I think training is probably the cheapest way possible to avoid cybersecurity incidents. So many that are out there could have been avoided by some training. So not a full answer, but at least that's a quite helpful snippet.
Very quickly, adding on to what you were saying, it's an evolving field. Now, you have to understand what you have control over. And I don't know what the interaction is with LLMs or however you're going, querying what cloud service providers are providing. Now, LLMs are built on the entire internet. And now the question is, are you going to expose yourself to the entire internet? You're not, really, I'm exaggerating here. But within the context of Azure or OpenAI or any of the LLMs that you're dealing with behind the scene, what you have control over is what's the input. Right? And what is the input? Input could be your data, all sorts of data. Like, input could be your prompts, how you prompt. And how you get answers, right, to your natural language interface. Now, that's where you can put your governance on top. Your data, your prompt engineering, the quality of your prompts, right, all of the work that you have to do up front as it's kind of interacting with the RAGs that you might have. I don't know how, I'm just kind of giving a generic answer. You may not be there or you might be already there. But I think the inputs and outputs coming out of your interaction with the large language models or the small language models, right, whichever you're using, that is one thing that you have to do. The second thing is, you have to get your legal policies and the risks that you're dealing with, right, have to be thought through. Because at the end of the day, depending upon what type of business you're in, when you're interacting with these models, what's the intellectual property that you are touching? Right now, are you liable for it or not? So I think the point here is that it's almost that you have to think that if you're introducing AI, and you're introducing Gen AI, right, within the space, now go and look at your policies and the risk frameworks that you might have already have in place and that you've been an existing company for a while, and start kind of making a checklist of what are some of the risks that you have to deal with, which ones you can, which ones you cannot, and what has to be modified, and how can you audit some of the risks that you have. What policies have to be created if those policies don't exist. So those are some of the preliminary work that you have to do, right? Protecting yourself, and then as you're dealing with these open models, there is an element of risk that you're taking. Right? How do you protect yourself is really where at least I would start thinking of as an architect.
You know, it's hard to add on with these two guys. They pretty much cover everything. I agree, training and education I think is really important because part of the problem is, as you mentioned, we're seeing a lot of AI just being bolted on to existing services. And, you know, my productivity hack could be my company's data breach. So I think really training people about what is considered acceptable use within the company. But also even giving some perspective on, well, why is this other vendor putting this in here? And what could be happening with it? So understanding the potential ramifications of what you're doing, I think is probably more significant in some ways. Obviously having governance, you have to, right? You're gonna have to attest that you have these policies at some point. Gary mentioned, you know, using IAM to control access to these things, and I think that's also excellent. But at the end of the day, right, we all have personal devices. It's not a big reach to imagine copy pasting, you know, information from your work computer, personal computer, into the, you know, unauthenticated ChatGPT and hoping for the best. So I think, you know, it's really a three-pronged approach at least.
Thank you.
Matt, did you have a question?
He covered it.
Covered it? All right. Other questions from the group? 4 minutes ago.
Do you know that this is the most people I've ever talked to about cybersecurity at once?
Yeah.
So you can pat yourself on the back for sticking it out. I know it's not the most exciting topic, but it could save you the most money.
The second one is data governance. Just
All right, well, if there's no other questions, let's get around it.